Yes, good evening, everyone. So my name is Paul Mosley. I know a bunch of you, actually. I've seen some very lovely names appear from friends, one of which I know who is cleaning snow in Colorado, in Denver. So obviously you'd have read a little bit about my background, but very, very briefly, I am a forest school practitioner. I've been a trainer for a number of years. I've been incredibly fortunate to have been flung all over the world to work with different people. And the thing that really always caught my attention was how these different places that felt so challenging for me felt as a home for them. And that's carried on to me becoming involved with academic research. I've just completed a master's and should be due to start a PhD. But with the forest schools, I'm an advisor to the board as well. And I offered to do this talk because it is such an important area. Interestingly, it's such an important area, I think, for forest schools, and yet doesn't really feature in the qualification itself. And I've been having such wonderful conversations with so many different academics and researchers and practitioners. I wanted to bring some of those thoughts to you to share, for you to be part of that conversation. A lot of time people think that if you start doing masters and PhDs and you have all the answers, the exact opposite is true. You just get super excited by all the questions you discover. So I'm going to share with you a presentation. If anybody wants to have a copy of this presentation, it is going to be available to you afterwards. I can see on the cameras some incredibly studious people with notebooks. And if that helps, that's great. But don't feel like you've got to rush through and keep track of everything. We're going to have, did I see, Matt, did I see that we can have breakout rooms?
Yeah, we can have breakout rooms. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a little idea that we might use later on for that. But if we can keep the microphones off, because I get very easily distracted, but feel free to pop anything into the chat. If I don't address it as we go through, then I'll come back to it, but I'll also give you my contact details. So if there's anything you want to discuss, any questions you want to follow up with, then I'm more than happy for people to get in touch. Okay, so I've called this the poetics of dwelling, and that'll sort of come around again at the end. One of the themes that I'm particularly interested in is, what does ultimately nature connection do? And we'll spend some time pulling apart some of those terms, things like nature, things like connection. What are they? What do we really do with them? But ultimately, what does it mean? Very obviously, there are sustainability challenges that we're facing, which we'll have a little look at. But I also want to address what it does for us as individuals and communities as well. So poetics of dwelling comes from a very well-known anthropologist called Tim Ingold, and he talks about how we are in place and how we are of that place as well. We're going to be picking up on a few different terms and sort of separating them really, because you do see them a lot and you see them kind of interchangeably used. So nature contact, connection, kinship, and culture. So to begin with, my buttons have to work. I have all the technology. Right. It's a press that thing, not to press that thing. So one of the things I always like to do with my presentations is just sort of dob my cap to my elders and the old guard, the people that inspired me and keep me in check. So on the left here, we've got Tim Ingold, who I've already mentioned, Dr. Chris Loynes, who's a professor at the University of Cumbria, Dr. Lisa Fenton, who got me into the whole academic thing. So this is really all her fault. And then there's Juha, who is one of the most important people I've ever met. He's a quiet Swedishman who teaches you more with his eyes than with his words. He was the person that taught me my craft originally. And then there's Uncle Dave, Dave Watson, who really guided and mentored me through many, many years. And so I always give thanks to all of these people. What I also need to do is I need to be able to recognize that I'm a person from a particular culture. I'm a white male. And that's important to do because quite often you find, even in research literature, a lot of people speaking quite universally. There's a research who I follow quite a lot, and one of the things I see them do a lot is talk about how all humans need to do X, Y, Z in relation to nature. And I've challenged them on this. I think it's really important that we make sure that we understand we are coming from our lived experiences, but also we can only speak to the boundaries of those experiences. And so it's very important that we don't start taking our ideas of nature and nature connection and start giving them to other people, assuming that they are the best ones. There are no best ones. It's not a hierarchy, it's a landscape. So I think it's really important to just sort of give a bit of context to that as well. Obviously, at the moment as well, we're facing huge environmental challenges. We've got industrialized countries, we've got consumerism culture, we've got the influence of sustainability efforts, but also regenerative efforts. And it's interesting to explore where maybe Forest School has relationships with both of those in slightly different ways. We've got efforts to push and pull towards sustainability. So push is in punitive, we make it more expensive to use this resource, we put a bigger fine on for not taking care of that piece of wastage, or pull, people actually driving themselves to live more sustainably and create more sustainable infrastructure. But interestingly, in and amongst all of that, we've got these notions about nature and more than human. One of my favorite people, he's not sort of one of my old guard, but he's certainly a really, really great influence on me, is one of my lecturers, Dr. McPhee, and it's impossible to say the word nature around him without entering into a 20-minute diatribe of deconstructing what the contemporary notion of nature is. So you've got to be very careful around him, but he has a very good point. And we'll look a little bit at this, but also we have to work with a language that people are familiar with and move forward. But I wanted to just introduce this term of more than human. I do have a few books which I'm going to be recommending throughout. There's about 10 here, so if I only recommend a couple, ask me at the end. So The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram. Quite a popular book already, but if you haven't come across it, I would certainly recommend having a look. And he introduces this idea of more than human. And it's about recognizing that the way in which we think about nature is inherited and developed through our culture. And we can see it as being something quite separate, especially if we live in perhaps quite an urban area. Nature is somewhere off there. And what David Abram was exploring with this language is we need to always recognize perhaps that we are within inside nature, that everything outside of us, we are still reliant upon, that we are a small part of. And so the more than human places nature as this thing that encompasses us rather than is separate from us. And so there's lots of little investigations and explorations of language and framing that's going on within the academic world at the minute. We'll explore a few of them. Some of the ones that I would refer to as being actually useful rather than just wonderful things for academic people to sit around and talk about. I wanted to ground this in a couple of different ways. So obviously with what's happening with the world, and maybe we'll explore where Forest School sits within that, but also in terms of the FSA principles. So within the principles, it cites this idea of the spaces that we are engaging with are spaces that we want to develop a relationship with. But also when it comes to holistic development, I think that our relationship with the natural world is, or potentially can be, very spiritual. So for me, I sort of describe spirituality as the sense of purpose, or the ways in which we feel ourselves connected to the rest of the world. So that's a way that I think we can recognize where nature connection comes in. And also there are many, many different aspects to Forest School. The photograph on the left here is Pando. Some of you may have heard of Pando. In fact, one person in the room was with me when we went to visit it. Pando is the largest and one of the oldest living organisms in the world. It's in sort of northern-ish Utah, and it is 106 acres of, as you can see here, stems. It's aspen, but all 106 acres is the same tree. So those are all stems that are all connected by the same root system. And so each one of those belongs to the same organism. And this very much is, I think, a great metaphor for forest school, where you've got this pedagogy underlying everything that everybody does. There's an ethos, there's processes, there's an episteme, which is the ways in which we go about learning things. And we have these principles, we have terms, there is research now that cites forest school, but equally it's what's called a social world, in the fact that there are many different people developing their own particular expressions of this approach. But in amongst that, we've also got, because this was the only way that it was going to sort of scare and get out to people, we've got these kind of industry market forces as well. So training, branding, the FSA being a body started to represent this idea of a professional industry. So there are all these different sort of themes and flavors that are going on and mixed together in lots and lots of different ways. And sometimes it's about recognizing that when we look at one subject, like nature connection, we can really idealize it in one, but it becomes quite pragmatic when we look at it from another. So I wanted to just pull out some of those themes so that hopefully these ideas kind of mull around in your mind and some useful questions come out later on, because we'll be getting back around to some of these points. But what I'd like you all to do for a moment is I'd like you to stare intently at this picture and maybe just make a couple of notes about what are the shapes that you see. I'm going to leave it as vague as that. Some of you may have seen this before, I'm not sure. I've used it a few times. Well, what kind of things do you see? And if you're old enough, like I certainly am, you'll remember the magic eye photographs from the 1990s, I think it was, maybe 80s even. There is no shark in there, I will give that away. There is no unicorn chasing a shark riding a unicycle. Okay, so if you want to, you start popping into the chat what shapes, what things you can see in there. So, edit point. So the question then is, before we get into nature connection, what is actual nature? We all perhaps have a intuitive sense of what that is, an assumption perhaps, but it's important that we can question some of those things sometimes. So I'd love everybody to have a little think, maybe pop down some things in the chat of what do we mean when we say nature? What is that word actually referring to? So what is nature? And then maybe by definition, what is not nature? And why is it not nature? If there's such a thing as nature, is it possible for us to have a thing that's the opposite of that? And whereabouts are humans within that? Are humans nature? Are the things that we create nature? Is nature beautiful? Is it always beautiful? Or are there sides to it that perhaps we would say are not? Do we imagine nature as a Wordsworthian poem all of the time? Or do we recognize there are other shades to it? There's a researcher who talks a lot about sort of noticing nature. Whenever he puts a post up about noticing nature, he puts a very artistic, beautiful photograph. I usually then follow up and put a photograph of something different, just to show a different side. So if we are always sort of romanticizing nature, to what point, I think it's fair to question, do we really embrace what nature is? Is there a particular aesthetic that we're drawn to? And if so, how representative of the whole of nature is that? So here you should see a crisp packet in the grass. So here's a question. Is this nature? Is this natural? Now, very intuitively, a lot of people might say no. Maybe we can find a way to say that it is. So if we think about the raw materials in the natural world, and then we think about gathering them, and we think about processing them, and then we think about manufacturing such a thing like a crisp packet from it, and then that gets deposited on the floor. At which point was it no longer natural? At which point do we say that humans and or the way that humans can create things is not a natural process? And there are ways that you can argue for and against this. But again, the exercise, this comes from Dr. McPhee, the exercise is just to consider, where do we draw the line? What are the boundaries of what we consider nature? Because then we can start to perhaps change the way in which we sense the world. And we'll look at this in a little bit. But here, okay, we've got humans and we've got nature and we've got high-vis jackets. What are the messages that these things are sending? Here we have a wonderful little photograph. What is the message that that is sending? What are the different messages, that we can see between this photo and this photo? So again, the imagery, the aesthetics that we give of nature really starts to influence how we perceive it and our assumptions about it as well. So what I'm interested in sort of taking us towards is this idea of more than forest school. So just like the more than human, the more than forest school. How can forest schools start to really explore some of the other themes that are happening in the world in terms of nature? Because I think I mentioned earlier on, it's really interesting that nature connection and nature kinship in various terms seem to be really integral to forest school, but then it's not really in the qualification anywhere. What I always tell people is, with things like the phase 1 survey, the impact assessment, the 3-year sustainability management plan, these are your opportunities to start to create kinship with place. These are your opportunities to start really creating a meaningful culture, a practice around how you engage with spaces and how spaces ultimately can become places. So those little terms are really useful to separate. A space is a physically identifiable aspect of the landscape. A place is somewhere that has meaningful relationships with a person. Okay, so there are lots of spaces. They are not necessarily all places. It's one of those little distinguishments we use in academia to explore quite different ideas. I also want to look at this idea of knowledge of and knowledge with. Knowledge of is being able to, cite the average age, the stem diameter, etc., facts about. Knowing with is a much subtler approach, where it's having what's called an affective relationship. So it does not matter to me in forest school and various other things I do, whether they call it by a certain name. It does not matter if they call it birch, because for me, ultimately, it's actually not even called a birch. That's just what some humans call it. What I'm only interested in is, what are they referring to it as, or how are they sensing it in the world? Because that speaks much more of their relationship to it than simply being able to riddle off a whole bunch of facts. I'm interested in episodic experiences, so going out and doing something just a few times versus having a continuous culture. What is it that forest school can do that perhaps starts to contribute to people's culture and how they fundamentally represent and relate to the natural world? We've got things like individual versus community-based experiences. And one of the things we are going to focus on is the sort of spectrum from contact through to culture. What are they? How are they different? And how are they interrelated as well? So we're going to start by really looking at this idea of affordances. So certainly anybody that's done trading will have come across this idea of affordances. For those of you that haven't come across this idea, affordances are ways that you can interact with the world and ways in which the world can interact with itself. Okay, so I've got a felt tip pen here. I can recognize an affordance of it that I can take the top off and I can write on paper. Okay, so that was the affordance it was designed for. I can also use it to bring something closer to me, or push something further away, or to scratch an itch I've got on my back. So there, it's not been designed for that, but these are affordances that I can recognize and apply it to. These two upturned cups here, these are wooden cups of originally Sami design. Like I say, they're upturned on Dr. Fenton's dinner table here. And we were talking about the affordances of them. So the cup on the left, the rounded one, this is made from a burl and it has been hollowed out. And the one on the right has been made from split sawn wood and has been hollowed out with chisels and various things. And when we're talking about how all the modern Cuscas have flat bottoms to them, whereas the original indigenous Sami Cuscas have rounded bottoms, simply for the fact that they spend so much time out in the snow that it's much easier to place a rounded cup down in the snow than it is a flat-bottomed one. And so we were looking at how do affordances and the way in which we perceive the world change our relationship to it. So the stories that we tell ourselves about the world. So if we say the story of going out into the woodland is that it's scary, it's muddy, it's wet, it's dangerous, the ways in which we perceive it, the ways in which we can see ourselves interacting with it are vastly different than if we take a different story with us. Much like, it's a subtle difference, but it's much like the difference between we own and the wood is there for us to use versus we are just one of the species using the wood. That change in story there ultimately influences how we see ourselves interacting with it. And likewise, when we start to learn how we can interact with things, that can change the story. So what might seem like a scary, inhospitable, and inaccessible place, once we start to maybe learn a few things, and I don't necessarily mean that we are taught it, we will most likely discover it for ourselves, those affordances start to change the story of that place. So I actually did this for a piece of research late last year. I went out with a couple of friends of mine, went out to the Utah desert. I was looking for a habitat that I'd never been to. I've been to bush, rainforest, Arctic. I'd never been to a desert. And so I wanted to go out to a place that I would experience being completely lost and completely unfamiliar with all of the ecology out there. And then what I did was I started to explore and experiment, and I started to discover things. I started to find materials that are brittle and light that could maybe lend themselves to firelighting. I started to dig down and find roots. Some of them were nice and soft and full of water. Maybe they would lend themselves to being eaten. And so the whole little the trip was really about trying to find, how do you go from being completely in an alien environment to beginning to perceive it differently? And the key thing that we were doing here is looking at, as I begin to experiment, as I explore, as I discover things, my perception of that place begins to change. So bringing this back into nature connection then, if we appreciate just the aesthetic beauty of nature, that's one thing. We can get a certain amount of relationship from that. If we then actually start to be able to understand it by having a deeper relationship built on experimenting, exploring with it, then that's ultimately going to change our perception of it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to know the names of things. It's by getting in and playing with the materials that it's really important. I always teach people that some of the most useful aspects of being out in nature in regards to play and for school is the fact there are lots of things, there are loose parts. The fact that each of them hasn't been designed for what we want to use it for, whether that's climbing, whether that's firelighting, whether that's carving, making a den from it. So we have to recognize the affordances that are out there. And the amazing thing about natural materials as well, to kind of finish this little triangle off, is that all of these materials have compound flexibility. Okay, some of you that have done your training are having flashbacks to training now. So it's the affordances and being able to read them within the landscape that changes the way which we relate to the landscape. With that, we get this incredibly overlooked aspect of how we relate to place. And it's what's called the embodied sensation. So I'm sure everybody has played with a little bit of hazel or willow or something of that nature. When you've spent some time doing that, the more you do it, the more intimate you get with it. If you then go and on a walk, let's say, you're walking down a river and you walk past a willow tree, you have a sensation of it beyond just how it looks. And so this idea of embodied sensation is when we get to handle materials, and it doesn't need to be for a particular goal, just by handling them, by manipulating them, we build up this sensation, we build up this repertoire, we build up this intimacy with the materials of that space. And so rather than just knowing about it, like I say, I don't worry about if someone knows something's called hazel or willow. That's not really the focal point for me. It's whatever they want to call it. We've had some children call it the bendy tree. Others, I told them a story once and they called it the Popeye tree. I'll tell you the story in a minute. Once they have a reference term for it, it's then how do they experience it? Because that embodied sensation is something they carry with them. It's a very overlooked aspect of nature connection. We might have knowledge of something, but knowing with something, this is part of this aspect, this embodied sensation. So on the left here, there's a picture of, yes, 3 different pieces of hazel that I've twisted into withies. The one in the middle is sort of the classic version. And I told the children once that I'd been up to Scandinavia where they have competitions and they can take huge, ginormous pieces of this tree and twist it. And I said, and their arms are like Popeye. And once we got over the fact that that was a reference they no longer got because I'm very old, and I explained who Popeye was, they then started to call it the Popeye tree. So the word hazel never really came up. They really didn't know what Popeye was. I think some of them went home and Googled it or YouTubed it. But those terms of reference didn't really matter. It was they know they can go and start to manipulate this material. And then from that, they can begin to have this embodied sensation of it. And then from that, they feel a deeper connection because they've got this embodied sensation. We explored this idea year before last, sorry, of walking with. And it's just an interesting little trajectory that I wanted to include. So we talk about going for a walk. And we've got this term hiking, for example. But very often we're walking to, through somewhere, from somewhere, or for something. And we were exploring how can we have this idea of walking with, where it's about the place, not going through it or from it or just to get something from it, but actually walking with place and with animals of that place as well. And one of the things we started doing was we started looking at all the different terms, this rich history of strange little English terms. Bimble, potter, snaffle, snudge, plodge. Go and Google them and find out what they are, and then have a go at doing them as well. I was at a very reputable international research conference last year, talking about this. And at the end, quite a few professors came up to me and said, could you give us demonstrations of all these different words? And so we were outside on the grass, and they're all PhDs. I'm a lowly master's student, but these are all PhDs and doctors and professors and all sorts. Walking around, I mean, Warple is kind of like a staggering toddler. So you can imagine 15 international professors stumbling across the grass in Cumbria, learning how to warple from a strange Englishman. But the idea is that the way in which we move, the purposefulness with which we move, has a huge impact on how we perceive the world around us. If we're always orientated towards an outcome, we interact and we notice things very, very differently than if we're having a potter, if we're having a bit of a bimble. So one of the things that we're exploring is, with this walking with, how do we make it so that it's not about going anywhere, it's about the experience of it. And we can see the comparisons here with Forest School perfectly. With the Forest School, it is not about, can we get A, B, C, D, E, and maybe F done? It's, this is where we are, and let's see what happens with this place. Because if we're not bimbling in forest school, we're perhaps getting drawn into hiking. And I know schools always want us to hike somewhere and get there and achieve the outcome. But actually in forest school, we want to bimble, because when we bimble and we potter and we snaffle, that's when we really notice place. And it's only by having a slower, more open approach to our pedagogy can place and nature really start to become an integral part of it. So when we start to think about this idea of nature connection, there's actually lots of different types. One of the problems in the literature and with a lot of field practice at the moment is that it's reduced down to a single idea. So again, I'd love for everyone to have a little think for a moment with some of these questions, pop some thoughts, respond to each other's thoughts as well. But how are we in relationship to nature? Or more specifically, how are you in relationship to nature? What do you mean by that? Does that mean you've got really nice pictures and plants in the house? Does that mean that you prefer not to be in the house? You prefer to be in the woods? In fact, maybe have you even overly just popped in to use the Wi-Fi, you're back out to sleep with all the badgers in a little bit. So is it a healthy one? And what do we mean by that? So a lot of nature connection practice is based around human well-being. It's very extractive. It's very much, nature has huge benefits to us, therefore we ought to use more of nature. And there's no problem in and of itself with that, only if that becomes the main way in which we consider it. And there are other ways that we consider our relationship with nature. One is based on equity, as in we see ourselves as having responsibilities for it as much as it does for us, perhaps. Which parts of our world are actually in relationship? Is it professional? Is it personal? Emotional, physical, spiritual? So it's really important that we get away from this kind of monolithic idea of nature connection, that it's one thing. We use what's called ethnography, which is all about understanding the individual experience. And you can understand collections of people as well, but it's about recognizing that it's the personal experience that matters, not the score sheet that they fill in, because it's the personal experience that really gives you an insight into the intimacy that they have with the natural world. Okay, so it's this idea of kinship craft that I'm really excited by. I think within forest school, there is already a huge amount of goodwill and interest. I think there's an opportunity to take it much further. I think we can start to really look at how do we create relationships with our own ecologies. I'm going to put up a few photographs in a minute of my own ecology and discuss a few different ways that I explore my relationship with it. But how do we actually start to really get to know and become intimate with our own landscapes and the other species that live alongside us as well? And within forest schools, especially, the play and the invitations that we give, there are ways that we can start to explore the avenues to become more in relationship with the natural world and with our place. And there's a huge difference as well between being performative and transformative. I'm not going to go into this too much, but very briefly, performative is where it looks really good. And not to sort of cliche it too much or to generalize too much, perhaps, but when you have activities, they tend to be performative. It looks like there's good nature connection efforts being made here, but actually by allowing them the freedom to go and explore, discover, experiment all for themselves, that's when it becomes more transformative. That's where they're able to develop their own unique, nuanced set of embodied sensations. So rather than trying to manufacture nature connection, we should try to allow it to be nurtured. So that's the difference between performative and transformative. Some of you, I think, possibly, maybe one or two, can recognize this area. So this is nature. This is the geology of a particular part of the United Kingdom. The particular part is where I live. But it's interesting how hard it is to perhaps recognize using that kind of information. I can see some of you and your cameras have moved really close and are looking very carefully for little details. So what I'm going to do now, excuse me, is I'm going to lay over the human settlements. Okay, so some of you might recognize it now. Okay, so we've got Birmingham there, and then we've got the Peak District just at the top. But again, that for me really is an interesting little exercise, as simple as it is. When we talk about nature connection, it's interesting how hard we find ourselves able to orientate ourselves still without human infrastructure. What I'm doing at the minute is a project with a few different people where we're trying to focus on, rather than nature being this just big ubiquitous thing, that actually it's about place. So this is my place. The non-profit that I run, Explore Nature, we focus on this watershed. Rivers have always been an incredibly important feature in the landscape. It's only with the invention of roads that they've sort of become a barrier rather than a highway. But irrespective of that, they still massively influence the land and the natural world, obviously. So here I am off into Staffordshire Trent Valley, over to the left here. And then the Trent Valley continues on further up towards the northeast and eventually comes out at the Humber. And so what I do with my nonprofit is we focus on people, particularly in the Dove, the Staffordshire Trent Valley, and the Tame, Anchor and Mees watersheds, because we're trying to help people relate to the land. The land is their immediate expression of the natural world. And so rather than trying to connect people to this generalized abstract notion of nature, which unless you've been to every kind of habitat in the world, really you've not experienced nature, we're trying to get people to recognize their relationship to land. And one of the most obvious ways of doing that is by recognizing the watersheds in which they live. And it also provides unique opportunities, for example, to look at where are their migratory patterns? Where do you get seasonal visitors? I had a conversation with someone the other day about where they'd seen the lapwings. They haven't come over to my part of the watershed yet, but they have to somebody else's in another part. So one of the things I'm going to encourage everybody to do in this spirit of nature connection is start to get to know your land and get to know where its rivers and watercourses are and where they interconnect and where they lead off to. And also have a look at the geology, just get to know a little bit about it. My favorite way of exploring geology with people is actually to do natural pigment work, where we will go and gather different soils, different rocks and crush them down. But you can also go online and have a quick look at a geology map and just get a sense of what's going on. And then on top of that, you've got some sort of interesting foundations that you can start to sort of build out a richer understanding of the land. So all of this is really coming towards this idea of place responsiveness. So like I said, rather than having this overall sense of nature connection, let's think about sense of place. And let's think about the other beings that we share that place with. So ultimately what it does is it makes us really focus on one of our local stories. What is the local history, perhaps? What are the local populations of deer? Where are they? How healthy are they? Where are their badger sets? So when we think about our particular site where we run for a school, and we've done our phase 1 surveys and things for it, we can start to think further out. Where do the birds come from, go to? Where are their fox runs? Where do the rabbit warrens give them access or not? So think about, how does our particular site fit into the larger landscape? And how can we help those that we're working with perhaps to get a sense of that? Now, obviously, depending on their age, that's going to have a massive factor. But there are some very simple, subtle ways that we can introduce this. And if your woodland doesn't have a name, give it one. It's amazing the difference that makes. So we can think about, what are the seasonal changes? And do you notice a change over subsequent seasons? So, for example, have the snowdrops come out yet where you live? Were they out this time last year? What other changes have you noticed? What about the hazel catkins? Where I live, the hazel catkins are doing some odd things at the moment. What are the different climates and the different habitats that you have around you? You might work on a school site, let's say, that's got a small little area, but by you getting to know your land, that is going to come through your practice. What are the different populations? So yes, you've got humans, but what about deer? What about badger? What about fox? You can even go to specific habitats like ponds, find out what the toads are. Do you have natterjack, or do you have some newts? What are the stories? So what have you noticed changing over time, or what are you aware of historically? So where I live on Cannock Chase, one of the big stories that's happening is that a lot of the land is being changed over from timber production to being turned back into native broadleaf, and the heathlands are being extended. And so there's a huge change of story in terms of what people have grown up knowing, what they experience, and maybe what their grandchildren will then experience. Think about what are the spaces in terms of, there is a woodland over there is a valley there, there's a pond there. And think about places. There is this trail that I always take my dog on. There is that little tree that my children always like to climb. And think about the stories that you have within the landscape yourself personally. And think about what are those places that are really special to you, and what are those other spaces, and perhaps you can start to experience them mindfully. What are the materials? How do you interact with them? What are the affordances? So this is a great opportunity to think about CPD. How can you, and that doesn't need to be formal CPD either, just going out and spending time with people who might know something slightly different from you. And so, for example, this time of year, myself and a few of my friends were talking to each other about the birch sap, of whose is ready. And by me knowing some of my friends down south, what's happening with theirs, it helps me start to plan what's happening with mine. So the more you talk to people, the more little things you start to find out. And then also consider, whose sense of place am I walking into here? So tracking is a wonderful, wonderful skill. Again, you don't need to go on a course really, you just need to be able to slow down, pay attention. You might not even know what caused the track, but being very present and mindful of the fact that a track has been left by another living species, that is a fantastic start. That starts to give this sense of, I am sharing this place, which is very different to, well, I own this place. This sense of sharing this is an important step towards a real sense of culture with nature. Yeah, so again, this is just looking at tracking. This is a part of a bit of research we did last year, where we took people out, asked them to go and have a look around. They dutifully followed all of the footpaths and came back, and I got them to paint some pictures for me. And then we went out and I was teaching them how to track the deer. We tracked the deer, and it changed the way in which they perceived the place. So the picture on the left here was, well, the deer came through this bit of grassland. Okay, you have to trust me on this if you can't see it, but there is a track that goes through that grass. It's sort of from bottom left to top right almost. And then we've got to talk about, how do you feel this place? Is it any differently? Is it differently perceived if you consider that they really are the owners of this place, that they are the ones that live here, you are a visitor, you're an outworlder? And so they started to explain how that will feel different. And we then developed the picture on the right. So the picture of the right down in the very middle, is a dark little spot, which is a deer slot, where a deer has walked right through. And it was about trying to just represent the different ways in which they sensed that place. Once they began to really sense that this is of the deer, this place belongs to the deer, they are a visitor in there. And so it wasn't that the deer walked through their place, it's that they are stumbling and tripping over and causing a lot of mess in the deer's place. And just that little shift is quite important ethically. because it changes the way that you treat places. So to sort of start to wrap up, we're sort of moving towards these ideas, these different ecologies. So different ecologies give different sensations. So what do we mean by ecology? Well, it's the way in which you perceive the world. And a lot of the times you don't necessarily recognize how you perceive the world. And even if you do, it's very, very hard to recognize how other people perceive the world. So we'll have a look through them and then we'll sort of look at how this builds. So firstly, we've got shallow ecology. It's where the natural world is important to us as humans, and on that basis, that's why it should be looked after. And believe it or not, it's quite easy to actually do virtually any kind of nature-based program whilst still being a shallow ecology. So if you think about forest bathing, is human benefit that's being drawn out, and that's the basis for that interaction. You could actually run a forest school program and it still be a shallow ecology. It depends on what your intention is. If you then move into deep ecology, it's where you're recognizing that actually nature has an intrinsic value and we should look after it for its own sake. Whether humans benefit or not from it, we should look after it for its own sake. But on the left here, we're recognizing, or we're perceiving, that we consider nature to be separate from humans. Okay, when we get to dark ecology, which is developed by a wonderful author called Tim Morton, dark ecology, where people say they have sort of climate crisis anxiety with deep ecology, dark ecology is full midlife crisis. Okay, so dark ecology is where you realize there is absolutely no differentiation between humans and nature. And it's more than just a conceptual idea, it's this embodied sensation. You have a feeling of how interconnected nature and the human world is. And then out of that comes what's called a flat ecology, where you enter into this peer-to-peer relationship. And not all, but the vast majority of indigenous communities have some form of flat ecology. They don't see nature as being separate. They have this embodied sensation of it is part of them and they are part of it. And they see themselves as having a peer-to-peer relationship with things within the world. So the way in which we think and perceive and embody our relationship with nature ultimately has a big influence on the way in which we act. So what are pedagogies? We've got pedagogy, which is the way that we teach or the way in which we encourage others to learn. And then there's hortagogy. So hortagogy is self-led learning. One of the things that I sort of argue with is that hortagogy is the most productive way through which you can create nature connection. Because what it does is it allows you to move beyond teacher-led ideas and curriculum-based ideas. So we've got this thing called the Linnaean framework. So if you've learned things like Birch, Fetcher, Pendula, that's the Linnaean system. It's all about facts, figures, data. We want to be able to change that and maybe think about knowing with. So again, those intimate experiences with the natural world. And there is also this idea of nature contact equals nature connection. So there is a correlation, but there's not a direct link. Yes, you can develop more of a connection through spending more time in nature, but one doesn't necessarily mean the other. So again, it's coming back to this idea with the wild pedagogy of rather than having time to do something, it's about having time with. So nature connection happens through creating time with, rather than having a focal outcome pedagogy of time to. And then there's another extension to this. So we've got with wild pedagogy, just to go even further. So we've got this idea called affective ecologies. How do people feel? How do their emotions react, respond to things in nature? How do people celebrate and protect nature? How do people actually bring that into their everyday? And this is where, as a forest school practitioner, as an outdoor learner, just as an environmental enthusiast, activist, we can start to think about all of the different pressures that our natural spaces are experiencing. There's pressure from above. We need to equal that with desire from below. So we need to be getting in touch with, working for, volunteering for organizations that are trying to rewild our land. So as part of thinking about nature connection, we need to think about, rather than nature, think about place. What is the more than human of place? And we need to understand ourselves as part of that. We influence it and it influences us. And there's this lovely term that's starting to now appear in the research called rhizomatic personhood, which is a very fancy way of saying people and place are of each other. You cannot separate them. And I think that's a really interesting idea to then take forward and start to look at how people and place start to work together to create healthier relationships that are focused on things like the watersheds. So just to finish, these are a couple of terms which I'm always interested in talking with people, because it just changes the tonality of what they're doing with Forest School. So I don't like the term program. It has this formulaic, linear sense to it. What if we were to call them communities instead? Rather than running a Forest School community, we are nurturing a Forest School. So rather than running a Forest School program, we are nurturing a Forest School community. And within that community, we can begin to recognize other species in place. We can think about the framing of it. Are we doing something educational? Or are we also perhaps doing something cultural? Is this about knowing of, or are we also exploring this idea of knowing with? Yeah, so instead of walking to or through somewhere, we're actually walking with places. Doing and being, this is quite a common one on training that we talk about. What could they be doing here? What can I do for this? Actually, a lot of the time with Forest School, the challenge, if you like, in the training, and then the challenge of taking it back certainly to educational settings, and then the challenge with almost challenging the expectations of the children, is it doesn't need to be about doing. You can actually just be, and that can change from moment to moment, which actually underpins the role of the Forest School practitioner in their observations and their reviews and reflections, to really understand what's the value experience that they've had, rather than to what degree they completed the outcome, the activity. So what matters in our world influences what and how we learn, which influences ultimately what we value. This is a really key interaction. And the last couple of slides here is just to explore this. I don't want to spend too long on it, because I can really waffle on about all this kind of stuff. So in the middle there, we've got our values, axiology, okay? The things that we really want to protect, the things that really matter to us that we would never want to betray, okay? Our values are ethics. Then we've got our epistemology. So how do we learn about the world? So Forest School offers a way of learning about the world which isn't about facts and figures. It is about assessments. It's a way of intimately exploring the world in a way that has this embodied sensation to it, if we allow it to. And then ultimately, we've got this thing, these complicated things called ontologies and cosmologies, which ultimately is, okay, so what is the world? And what exists and what does not? And so I want to focus on sort of building up from the bottom here in these last few slides. Firstly, I just want to come back to this. So just having a look at the chat here, just looking at some of the things that people said they saw. Okay, so just by show of hands, who saw straight lines and boxes? Okay. Oh yeah, you can do it on video, or you can do it with the raise hand thing. Okay, hands down. Okay, hands up who sees circles. That's 7 people who feel really smug right now. Okay, so I can see from people's expressions, there's a few kind of furrowed brows of, what do you mean circles? I can't see circles. I'll put a link to the, or actually you can get the presentation, you can sit and look at it for as long as you like, but there are both. And this is the whole idea of ontologies, is that the way in which you see something is the only way in which you can see something. If you can't see it, you can't see it. And there's no real way of explaining it to somebody. And so this is where we can start to think about all of the different ways in the world in which people perceive the world. We need to be very, very careful in how we engage with them. Okay, I'm going to click off this. I know some people are really straining to see circles now, or see squares, depending on what they could see. But the predominant way in which we have been encultured to recognize nature is through facts and figures, this Linnaean knowledge. We think about engagement, we think about deep ecology, and that's still relatively new. But there are so many others. So this is a little something I put together to help trainees think about different ways that we can interact. So firstly, we've got nature contact. Here we focus on the engagement, the utility of a place, and it's very much about how it enables us, the I can statement. And so here really we're looking at a shallow ecology. We're looking at what we can do at this place. Then we can start to consider connection. This is where we start to recognize there's inherent qualities. We can have an emotional reaction to places, to features in nature. They matter to us more. And this is where we're starting to recognize an intrinsic value. So we can start to say things like, it is beautiful, it is important, it is habitat. And so here we're moving into a deep ecology. And this is where we're perhaps more likely to do things for place. We're going to think about what we can do to look after a place. But like I mentioned earlier on, we can still recognize and think of it as separate. We make a little jump then into kinship. Kinship is where we begin to personally identify with place, where we start to see how the place has influenced who we are. Now, that might be from childhood, or that might be from the point where you connect richly, spiritually with place. But you recognize that place has a role to play in who you are as a person. And so this is where you can begin statements, for example, I am because, so I am because of the forest in which I grew up in as a child, which I still live on. I lived in the north, now I live just to the south of it. And this is where we're getting into this flat peer-to-peer relationship, where we start to think about doing things with place. And then finally, culture, where it's a shared identity, where people within place start to recognize the value of it, start to recognize how they are informed by it, how they identify themselves from it, and they begin to share ways in which to celebrate that. I'm not going to go into this now, lots of post-humanism stuff. I'll just touch on this. So mentioning earlier on this idea that nature connections, of which there are so many, influenced by culture, we need to be very, very careful. It's something that I'm writing a paper on at the moment with someone, where with the best of intentions, things like forest school are being taken all around the world. And what can happen is that we take our European sense of nature and connection out to different places. And that's called epistemic colonialism. We're taking Western values and then giving them to others because they're the best, obviously, because they've come from us. Equally, there's the other side of we can appropriate indigenous knowledge without any care or consideration. This isn't so much an issue nowadays, although it is in some places an issue, where you see that you can do nature connection by learning Native American traditions, for example. Both of these we need to be very, very aware of. There's a fine line in between them, but there are more and more processes and ideas that are coming out which actually avoid these two. But ultimately, this is what we're trying to do, or at least this is what I think we can do with Forest School. Rather than it be a surface culture where it's just about the things we do, it's actually about deep culture. It's about who we are as a people. It's about who we are in relationship to the land. And it's about where we make choices that aren't in our own interests, ultimately, but about the long-term benefits that's there for nature and us, because we are one and the same. Okay, I think we'll finish that there. This kind of just goes over a couple more points, but I think we've covered these already. All right, so could we maybe get people to go into breakout rooms just for 5-10 minutes or so, just to have a chat, see what thoughts come up, see what questions that anybody wants to ask, and then we'll come back and we'll field a few questions. Does that make sense for everyone? Yeah, so if anyone's got any questions, if you want to pop it in the chat, I've got the chat box open here. While people are doing that, I'll just make the book recommendations. So these two books are by the same author. The first is called Ecological Identity. And the second is called Bringing the Biosphere Home. Okay, so Ecological Identity and Bringing the Biosphere Home. And the author of these two books is Mitchell Thomas Show. Mitchell Thomas Show. Where can you find out about my research? I've actually got a really, really half put together website at the moment. So I'll put it in the chat actually, paulmosley.org, www.paulmosley.org. So that's where, when I get around to it, there's going to be lots of blog stuff about the sort of research side of it. And then that's my non-profit there. So there's those two, or I'm going to be putting lots of book reviews and things. We'll put the correct spelling out in the email that follows up. Braiding sweetgrass, lots of people know this. Robin Wall Kimmer, Kimmerer. Okay, so she is Indigenous and she writes about the Indigenous experience. And I think there's some areas that are really worth rereading a couple of times because there's a lot of subtlety in how she's presenting the position of how she experiences the world. And then these two here, these two here, this is actually fiction. So there's a genre called solar punk. So we're familiar with cyberpunk and steampunk and things like this. Solar punk is writing about possible futures where sustainable technologies and rich relationships with the more than human become the center of our culture. So if you put in solar punk, you'll get lots of stuff come up on Google, but these two are my favorites. So this is called Sun Vault. It's Sun Vault, Stories of Solar Punk and Eco Speculation. Lovely fancy terms. And then this one's called Multi-Species Cities. So I'm just getting into this one. I've just read a few of the stories in this and it's wonderful. So it's literally about how communities become multi-species in the future. So solar punk urban futures. But we'll put all of those details into the email that follows out. So Holly, do you think it's important to recognize people's starting point with their connection to the rest of nature? Yes. Some people might start with a more Linnaean interest and develop a deeper connection from there. Yeah, absolutely. The point I was trying to raise, which I hope came across, was that it's not the only one, that it is prioritized a lot of the time. And eventually they all kind of intermingle. but I think it's about saying that the statistics, the facts about, are not in the context of what we're looking at with nature connectedness as important as the intimacy with. So it's about the time with and the experience of rather than knowledge of. But yeah, absolutely. Wherever people start from, it's important that they start there. Because if you try and take people too far out of their comfort zone, then it's something they can't really rationalize and make sense of. We decided we're going to explore the ways of walking in the next few weeks. Excellent. And that deserves to be videoed and put on YouTube. Everybody should video themselves walking at least once. I should really do a set of videos on different walking styles, shouldn't I? Like, it came through a piece of research we were doing about how linear we walk and how we follow, excuse me, footpaths. So we also decided to take our shoes off, and we allowed the birds to decide which way we walked and for how long. And now we start to explore the walking with. Oh, and then we let the wind tell us as well. The wind took us for a walk. So if anyone's not been to university, you think that we sit and do serious stuff. We don't. We muck about and we discover new interesting ideas.
We've got too many brambles in our sight to be able to do that.
Yeah, what was a delicate, I think sharple from memory. It was a very delicate way of walking. So you might sharple.
Yeah. If anyone else has got any questions, then pop them in the chat. But if not, then we can thank Paul for his time, and then and wendle our own ways.